Robert Henderson turned the key at 5:30 on a spring morning in 1948 and heard nothing. Not the grinding of a dying starter, not the click of a weak battery, just dead silence. His Farmall M tractor, which had run perfectly the day before, sat in his Iowa machine shed like a 2-ton paperweight. 200 acres of corn needed planting, spring rains were coming, and his tractor wouldn't even try to start. What Robert didn't know was that a component smaller than his thumb had broken during the night, and if he forced that engine to turn over right now, he had about 90 seconds before catastrophic damage destroyed his entire planting season. The battery was new, the lights worked. Something else had failed, something that whispered to Robert's instincts, "Don't force this." That whisper was about to save him $1,200 and 3 weeks of lost time, because thousands of farmers across the Midwest had already learned this lesson the hard way. A part so small and simple that most didn't know it existed could cascade through an engine with devastating speed. The evil genius of this particular failure was its stealth. The engine would start, idle smooth, sound perfectly normal for 30 seconds, while residual oil provided false security. Then temperatures would spike, metal would grind on metal, and by the time you heard the death rattle, your tractor was already scrap. Robert had come home from the war in Europe 3 years earlier and inherited this farm from his father. He'd grown up around tractors, but his father had always handled mechanical work. Now he stood alone, nearest neighbor 2 miles down a gravel road, implement dealer 12 miles away in town. Every decision in the next few minutes mattered. He turned the key again, listening hard. The solenoid clicked. Power was reaching the starter. But the starter motor itself stayed silent. Not seized, not grinding, just silent. Like something was physically preventing it from engaging. Robert's hand froze on the key. His father's voice echoed, "When a machine won't do what it should, there's always a reason. Find it before you force anything." Deep in the Farmall M's engine sat a gear called the oil pump drive. Size of a silver dollar, 1/4-inch thick, hardened steel with precisely cut teeth. Its only job was spinning the oil pump that kept pressurized oil flowing to every bearing and cylinder wall in the engine. When it worked, you never thought about it. When it failed, you had minutes before everything inside that engine destroyed itself. Robert's gear had developed a hairline crack 3 weeks ago. Manufacturing in the 40s wasn't perfect. Heat treatment created internal stresses, microscopic impurities propagated through steel, and sometimes a gear that looked flawless had a time bomb inside it. Every revolution spread the crack deeper. Last night, in the cold dark, a tooth finally snapped off and fell into the oil pan. Now that broken tooth sat waiting like a piece of shrapnel, and the damaged gear couldn't mesh with its partner anymore. Worse, the broken piece had wedged itself in the engine's guts, jamming the crankshaft solid. If Robert started that engine, the loose tooth would pump through the oiling system in seconds, wedging in passages, jamming the pump, or circulating like a metal bullet, grinding bearings and cylinder walls to scrap. For 30 seconds, everything would seem fine. Then the protective oil film would burn away and the engine would tear itself apart from the inside. Robert stared at the tractor. He could walk to Frank Morrison's place and borrow an older, slower tractor. He could hitch his semi-retired horses and lose 3 weeks planting 200 acres the old way. Or he could try diagnosing this himself with limited knowledge and parts that might take weeks to arrive from Rock Island. He grabbed his father's toolbox, tools worn smooth from decades of use, handles dark with oil. The owner's manual showed battery connections first, then starter solenoid, then starter motor. Battery terminals were clean, solenoid clicked, starter stayed silent. Robert slid under the tractor with a drop light, checking every wire. Everything looked right. He tapped the starter housing with a wrench, sometimes brushes stuck and a sharp tap freed them, climbed back up, turned the key. Nothing. This was where most farmers forced it. Hand cranked the engine or towed it behind a truck to bump start it. Either method would spin that engine over and start the destruction. But Robert's gut kept saying this wasn't electrical. Machines didn't just die overnight for no reason. He walked 2 miles to Frank Morrison's farm. Frank had been farming since 1923. He'd killed an engine himself back in '36, ignoring warnings and working through a failed water pump. The repair cost more than the tractor was worth. He'd never made that mistake again. At Robert's shed, Frank ran the same checks, then said, "Turn the key." The solenoid clicked. Frank shook his head. "Starter's getting power but not engaging. Something's stopping your engine from turning." He grabbed a breaker bar and fitted it to the crankshaft pulley at the front, designed for hand cranking if the starter failed. Frank threw his weight against it. Nothing. Tried the opposite direction. The crankshaft was locked solid. "Something inside is jammed tight," Frank said. "You start this, you tear it apart." They pulled the oil pan. Messy work, draining oil and unbolting the perimeter. When it came free, a broken gear tooth tumbled into Frank's hand. He held it to the light. "Oil pump drive. Lost a tooth. This was floating in there and jammed your crankshaft." For the next hour, they worked the crankshaft back and forth with the breaker bar, tiny increments. The tooth had wedged between the drive shaft and engine block, a perfect mechanical lock. With patience, they worked it loose without bending anything. When it came free, the crankshaft turned smooth. Frank removed the side cover. The gear's missing tooth left an obvious gap. "You need a new gear, but you caught this before real damage. You start that engine, you're looking at complete rebuild." 3 days later, the parts arrived. Robert lost 3 days of planting, manageable. If he'd started that engine, he'd have lost 3 weeks or more. The difference between a minor setback and catastrophe was the decision not to force something that felt wrong. Robert got his planting done slightly behind schedule, but the experience changed everything. He started watching his oil pressure gauge like a hawk, listening to engine sounds with new attention, performing maintenance on schedule instead of when convenient. That broken gear tooth sat on his workbench for years afterward, a small piece of hardened steel reminding him that the space between disaster and success could be as small as a missing tooth, and the farmers who survived were the ones who listened when their machines whispered warnings. The Farmall M ran another 23 years on his farm. When Robert's son started farming in the 70s, he used that old tractor to teach him the same lesson: respect your equipment, listen to what it tells you, and when something feels wrong, stop and find out why before you force anything. Because sometimes the difference between planting on time and watching your whole season disappear comes down to whether you turn that key one more time or walk 2 miles for help. Thank you for watching this story from America's farming past. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel for more agricultural history, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who appreciates the wisdom that kept farming communities running through challenging times. This video is inspired by real historical events and genuine challenges faced by American farmers during the 1930s through 1960s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or organizations. Robert Henderson is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar mechanical crises during this era, based on documented agricultural history and the collective knowledge of farming communities from that time.